Week 8, everybody. Welcome, and I hope you all are doing phenomenal and are ready to finish strong. So we're in the final week of Christian worship here, and you've got two things. Pretty big week, actually. You still have some reading to do. It's only 20 pages, and then the worship service design, as well as exam 2. And then you also, as usual with this course, you've got discussion board. So let me real quickly touch on the discussion board, both for this week, and then I'll go back and touch on last week's briefly, and then we'll get into the other stuff. So this week's discussion board, do Romans 14 principles apply to worship style in our churches? So go to Romans 14. I think this is addressed in your reading or the video, one of the two or both, and look in Romans 14 and say, based on that, do these principles actually apply to the way we do worship styles in church today? Now, as with anything, it's a different context then to what we have now. So that's why we say principles, meaning that when Paul talks about head coverings, he's talking about a specific context and reason and that sort of thing. He's not giving a new law. He's not giving a religious system. He's making recommendations for that current context and where they were at for a specific reason. So therefore, the principle behind why he made the reason is actually at the heart of it and what we should be applying today, not the fact of, if we are drinking the proper kind of wine or if we are wearing head coverings in the right places and that sort of thing. So that's the main dynamic with that. And then looking back over the last 8 weeks, are there key truths that have made an impact on your worship? So this is a chance for you to be reflecting back on how has your worship changed. Maybe sometimes the process is it's actually caused me to overthink things, and I'm now having to let go a little bit because I'm now overanalyzing everything in this worship class. But oftentimes people in this class, they're simply more attuned to things in their worship, or they're convicted in the heart that I need to take this more seriously in some way. Just start sharing with us what ways and what key truths have made an impact on your worship. Whether you know how to apply them yet or not is not necessarily the point, but it gives you a chance to at least reflect back on some of the things you're learning in the class and how to work it in. Then in terms of last week's stuff, I think I put that, left it up here. Okay. Remember that in week 7, you were discussing the role of music in worship and what about other creative arts and that sort of thing. I gave you a pretty good thought process of where I was thinking to start the week. I'm more curious of what you guys end up saying. And so there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but I pointed out that music is something that's used in every single worship context. I don't know how it's not. We're musical beings, whether you consider yourself musical or not. There is music attached to every culture and society forever, and everything going back to David. In Psalm, one of my favorite biblical stories is how David would play it's not actually a harp, but a harp-like instrument for King Saul when he was feeling oppressed and attacked spiritually, and it literally made the evil spirits leave and subside because of David's worship music that he played, which is a phenomenal piece. And certainly throughout church and biblical history, music isn't the only way to worship. That's a huge piece, and I don't know many worship leaders today that think that's the only way to worship. But I also don't know very many churches that don't incorporate music in some way in their worship services, and it's not a big part of how they lead worshipfully. So this is just a place for you guys to dissect that and to talk about other forms of creative arts. I've seen a lot of experiments going on in recent years. We're kind of past the age where most churches are really traditional. In fact, I would say most of the students coming in do not go to super traditional old school churches that play organ music and so forth, which, depending on what time period, that's a new invention in the last few hundred years, and not something that they would have done back in Bible times, as you all are well aware of. Then when you look at this next piece of the discussion, have you experienced conflict in your church regarding worship style? I don't know who hasn't. if some of you have grown up in a church, you probably that's maybe really well known for worship. If you grew up in Hillsong, there's now a Hillsong church here in LA area where I'm at, and obviously it's just been here a few years. But Hillsong itself is 30 years old. They've kind of been worldwide leaders in the modern worship music. And so those who grew up in Australia in Hillsong, they probably haven't had much conflict in worship style, because that's kind of part of their identity. You go to Hillsong, you know kind of the style of worship that you're going to get. And that tends to be the scenario, I think, in most places. Even if you have a more traditional, let's say your church uses organ music or whatever, that doesn't mean that there was going to be conflict over it if the entire church is really down with it and there's no pushback. But if what tends to happen is churches that are a little bit more traditional, but they're not necessarily building their identity about being traditional. As the younger people grow older and there's new worship styles and movements going on in the Christian world, it tends to conflict, and you get things like, oh, here's the traditional service and the contemporary service and things like that. So many of you are probably interacting with things like that. This is a space for you to talk about that, and you did, and we'll give feedback a little bit at the end, but this is the main thing of what I was just hoping to get out of you, not necessarily critiquing you in any way. And then finally, should a church offer contrasting worship styles? That's a big thing, because what happens when you offer a traditional and contemporary service is you just divide the church, sort of. You at least segregate it in some way, where the people that prefer one worship style are really going to separate themselves in the worship service from those that do it differently. So, and then this piece of physical worship, dancing, raising hands, and clapping. What about bowing? I think that's a fun one. I just wanted to see how you guys interacted with some of the scriptural words for worship. My big thing is, I think that I have very rarely not seen some of these things happening in true worship that's not prescribed, meaning you make someone do it. Although I'm not against everyone saying, I feel like we need to, as a congregation, now bow before the Lord. That's totally fine. But if you make it a religious thing and we're more spiritual, or we're worshiping more effectively because we bow, as opposed to I'm compelled to go low before the Lord, I just feel like I'm supposed to do this in worship. I've never seen a radically passionate worshiping community where people aren't physically acting out something of the activity going on in their hearts. And that's what I want to see. It's kind of the heart of what I'm hoping you guys get at, and very curious at the responses there. Flipping back here to week 8 and this worship service design, the theme of the service will be basically you need to design a worship service. You're going to use concepts and principles learned in this class, design and explain a hypothetical worship service, and you just need to go straight through this and answer the questions. The theme of the service is going to be this: God is our refuge and strength, out of Psalm 46. Other than the sermon, so you're not going to be doing the sermon, select and order all of the other elements of the service. Now, I understand a service can look much more different than this, but this is kind of putting somewhat of a traditional service in an order where you have a chance to just put some things in to give it a theme, if you will. And so other than the sermon, select and order all the other elements of the service. So think of it kind of like if you were going to do that old school, church bulletin and a brochure and an order of service sort of thing. You're going to write all that out. The service should be approximately an hour, 25 minutes for the sermon, 35 minutes for the other elements, and you will describe your service in a 3 to 5 page paper. So this is a full-on paper patterned after frame service description specifically on these pages. So I want you to specifically use that in your paper. And your service description should be similar to his in terms of explaining the elements and providing some of the details and offering, why you chose what you did. And then most worship planners have a variety of resources at their disposal. Here are a few ideas for finding resources to assist you. Okay, if you're going to use a hymnal, borrow one from the church, but I'm guessing at this day and age, many of you are not going to use a hymnal. I kind of hope you don't use a hymnal, to be honest with you. Not that there's not great hymns in it, but even the great hymns have been made into more modern worship sets that people in your generation are using rather than a church hymnal. And then borrow a similar resource for newer songs. You can use that. I'm not sure if I still think that's a great resource, but it's there if you need a resource. And then if you can't obtain these, look for online resources, and I think you guys can pretty much find them. Even if you wanted to search worship set on YouTube, you'll find things. But again, I want to see your songs play into your theme of what the worship service is about. Don't just pick your favorite songs. Okay, so that's what the worship service design is for. And then your exam is going to be a multiple choice exam covering the frame text, Bible reading, and the required video from lessons 5 to 8, and you'll have an hour to complete it. I'll post another video going over some tips on that exam. But for now, get going on this stuff. Have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions.